All right, today we welcome Katie Robinson, our Director of Recruiting Literacy and Student Athlete Development at Polaris Athlete, and even more importantly, a former collegiate student athlete at the University of Texas, as well as former college coach. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Katie.
All right, so I think clarity is really important. There's a lot of change, and the landscape in college athletics is ever evolving. Every 2 years, just so you guys know, every 2 years, each sport has the ability to adopt new legislation. So the changes of dates and when they can get recruited and the timeline of all of that can be changing. So I'm going to speak to today and what stands as of today in all the changing landscapes. So we're going to hit on timelines. We're going to hit on all the elements of how you can help navigate a student athlete through that recruiting process, and just making sure that they can go in fully educated and aware of all the pieces of the puzzle. Let's jump to the next slide. I think what's important is not just like talking about what really matters, but also talking about like what doesn't move the needle and just provides like a lot more stress and noise and anxiety around this process. A lot of times recruiting agencies are claiming to like have that exposure, and they're valuing the number of clicks that coaches are having on an athlete's profile. I can speak from a coaching standpoint, and I am 1,000 more times likely to respond directly when a student athlete emails me versus a recruiting agency. A lot of times I just ignored those recruiting agencies because I want to start building a relationship directly with the student athlete. I'm not looking for a third party intervention. So I don't think recruiting agencies are really moving the needle when it comes to recruiting. I think they're valuing the clicks, which is not really valuing an authentic fit. And so I also think that it's important to say that like egos can be driving these decisions. And I think this is an important piece of where counselors can be really impactful, is helping broaden the scope and the type of academic institution that the student athlete might be interested in. A lot of times they get so much pressures and a lot of social media impacting this, but like that flashy name brand school, and that's not always the best fit for a student athlete. I think that helping them open up the opportunities can really help them find that really good authentic fit that we talked about before. So let's shift over to talk about what's real. So skill level, this is like the most important thing for a college coach in assessing a recruit, a prospective student athlete, is that skill level at the top 2/3 of that team or at the bottom third? And truly, the bottom third is not what we actively recruit from a coaching standpoint. It's that top 2/3 of the team. If that athlete can immediately be in that top 2/3 from a skill level, that's what's going to open the door and cause like active recruiting from as we know it. So that skill level is the open the door or shut the door. And that is like truly what like starts that initial part of that recruiting process. And this is where I think there's a lot of misdirected anxieties when it comes to families and wanting their athlete or their student to get actively recruited. And I think they're directing that sometimes to you guys as counselors. And I think that really is a combination of the coach and the athlete to get that skill level to a point where they can get recruited to the right kind of institutions. I think everything under skill level is the part that we all as counselors and as people outside of that coach and athlete relationship, that's where we can help make that impact. And so I'm going to be hitting a lot more so on those parts that are going to be real and where we can have great effective improvement and impact on the student athlete. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so let's talk timeline and let's get clear on what that looks like. A lot of times, and you guys are experiencing this already, is that timeline is shifted significantly early in the student athlete's experience. So they have freshman and sophomore year, and then right at the end of their sophomore year is when they are able to get contacted by coaches. Now, there's some caveats, like I mentioned before. This is an ever-changing landscape of when that's the college coach can call, text, email the student athlete. But for the most sports, it's June 15th between that sophomore and junior year. The the exceptions right now are softball, baseball, and both men's and women's lacrosse. And that's because their sports go from like usually springtime into the summer. So those are during season. So they wanted to shift it back. So now their contact date is September 1 of the junior year. And then this kind of like helps paint the big picture. We're going to talk about each of these bullets of like each of these years and what that what's most important in each of these time periods. So let's go to the next slide. Perfect. All right, freshman and sophomore year. These are the building block years. These are when the student athlete is really trying to build their skill in the sport, which I said is the door opener or closer. And so that's really important that they're putting in that time for that. They're also starting to like really get a good understanding of how their strength in the school is important to their later access to college. So making sure that they're challenging themselves in the appropriate school and the classes, and then also are they doing well in those challenges? Through that and through those two ways, I think they build character, and that's that maturity piece. I mean, we've all seen the amazing maturity that an athlete can have from freshman year through senior year. And so I think that character building is part of that process. I don't think just talking about it is how somebody gains character. I think through experiences and through how they show up in their sport, how they show up in their school and in their classroom, those all are the pieces of the character that they will naturally build. And we can also like, I think it's good to like have it build naturally, but also call attention to how that athlete is maturing so they can speak on that, on their like character as well. All right, let's go to their junior year. This is a huge jam-packed year. This is when it can be pretty stressful for the student athlete. They're the open lines of communication. They're getting maybe tons of calls or maybe a lack of calls. So there's all this anxiety and stress, I think, that can be wrapped up in their junior year. And our job, I believe, is to help mitigate any kind of stress and to kind of bring it down, help them have clarity on this whole process, and appropriately and timely like navigate through each of these things. So they're going to have university visits. I'm going to talk a little bit about unofficial visits and official visits. Unofficial visits are when the student athlete is responsible for the funding of those visits, and an official visit is when the school is going to provide for that student athlete to come and visit their schools. So both happen a lot of times throughout that summer before junior year, but also throughout that junior year as well. This is when a lot of admissions are having to do some pre-reads for a student athlete. Again, that timeline from when admissions looks at the scope of a student athlete from an academic standpoint and from an admissions standpoint, it happens way earlier than the rest of the student body. So getting all of these materials in line and in place prior to their junior year can be really, really important. And then also we're going to have some like maybe start of early applications throughout their junior year. Each school is going to have that a little bit different. They're going to be, the student athlete's going to be sorting through scholarship offers or roster spot offers, and then hopefully getting to a good decision throughout that end of that process. All right. And then senior year, they're trying to finish strong. And I know senioritis can set in sooner and sooner, especially as that recruiting timeline has shifted earlier into their junior year. So what we can do is help making sure that they understand the importance of finishing strong. They need to keep advancing in their sport. They need to keep advancing in their school. They can't just take a break from the challenging APs or honors courses that they're taking. They need to continue to finish strong. And honestly, I think this character building, it's kind of accumulating through that senior year. They're having more autonomy in their lives, and they're having more, responsibilities in their lives as well. And so helping them navigate and stepping up to those roles and to those responsibilities is huge. Let me hit really quickly on admissions when it comes to senior year. So if they make a decision junior year, it's important to know as counselors that if their senior year if it falls short in any way, schools do have the right to pull that admissions spot. And this is what causes the crazy stress. So remembering to keep helping them know the importance of finishing strong, because if they lose that admission spot for that school their senior year, and they have to start over again at ground zero from the recruiting process, they're starting a year behind everybody else, and roster spots are extremely limited. Scholarship is pretty much mostly already divvied out and not available either. So the most important thing I can hit on is like making sure that they finish really strong their senior year so that they don't lose that opportunity. And then I will say also, the other thing with finishing strong is I finished up my coaching career at Stanford, and I think the admissions process at Stanford was its own beast of a thing. But I think that one of the things I think it's helpful to know is within the ability of a student athlete, if they are exceeding in their sport and exceeding in their academics, I think making sure that they know that, like, when it comes to their academic side of things, what Stanford was really looking for was, are they challenging themselves within the ability to challenge themselves at that school? So part of the admissions process was knowing the different regions around the whole world, really, and knowing what that school offers, and is that student athlete stepping up to those challenges that are offered at each of those schools? So one, are they challenging themselves? Second priority is, are they doing well in those challenges? And then third priority was really the test scores that we'll talk about in a little bit as well. But like, I think the challenging themselves within the scope that they're able to challenge themselves at their high school is really important. And that was the most important thing at a place like Stanford. Also at Northwestern, that's another high achieving academic institution that I've worked for. And they were also like, again, is that student athlete really pushing the envelope of how they can be challenged? So I just want to hit on that to, again, provide some clarity of like what we're seeing behind the scenes as coaches, to help you guys understand, again, where you can make the most impact. All right, let's dive into these critical moments. As I mentioned, that sophomore spring prior to then the June 15th call date and initiating the conversations, this is when a lot of like preparation for that recruiting journey to begin can happen. And I think it's, let's focus our attention on a few things. One, helping the student athlete gather those materials so that they are ready when a coach is asking in the summertime for like the transcripts and any kind of pre-SAT or ACT scores. I think that it's really great, and it shows a lot of just maturity from the student athlete standpoint of like, do I already have these things in order and organized to like quickly send out to these coaches, or am I going to have to scramble and make the coach wait until I get them these materials? So helping a student athlete get that all like, kind of wrapped up from an organizational standpoint and into somewhere where they can like pull it quickly. Now I think that's where Polaris Athlete and the Athlete Hub can be really helpful. They can store all these documents, all of these materials within their profile, and it's just a nice, easy spot for them to be able to go to, and again, have that organization in place. I think sophomore year spring is also where it's really great, where we can help them get clear on their priorities of what is important to them. And I know that that's really early and they're pretty young in this process. So that's where a little bit of, a little bit of help in that area can go a long way. This is when they start initiating contact. So I mentioned that June 15th is when college coaches can directly communicate with the student athlete, but there are no rules around a student athlete reaching out to a coach. So this is a great period of time for that athlete, for you guys to help create a athletic and academic resume to be able to send out to the top maybe 20, maybe 40 schools that student athlete might be interested in. And so putting that together in a resume, getting it out in front of the coaches won't be able to respond right away. But I loved seeing that as a coach when a student athlete was able to like put all that together and send it to me. It showed their initiative. It showed that they're organized. It showed that they have like pretty strong interest in my program. And the other thing is, like, when I'm looking to call, like I would start the recruiting process at a place like Northwestern, per se, I would start it with 150 female swimmers that I'm trying to call within the first like maybe 4 days of that June 15th start date. Now I would have my staff helping me. It's not just me making those calls, but if I'm trying to look for like anything that differentiates a student athlete from another, and I have maybe 20 emails from athletes on that 150 list already, knowing that they're interested, like when I go to call that athlete, I'm going to be much more excited and engaged with that athlete as well. So getting out in front of that June 15th timeline can be really great, I think. And it speaks initiative, which is the overall maturity of the student athlete, which we love to see as coaches. Okay, let's go on to the next part. All right. The summertime, again, this is like communication is open. Each school is going to have a different timeline as far as like when they want to do official visits, when they ultimately want a decision made by that student athlete. And so the athlete or the student athlete's just kind of gathering all this information with each school and how they're all different. But a lot of things should line up, hopefully. Helping them ask the right questions on all of these that like reflect on the priorities of that student athlete can be really helpful, especially when it comes to that, like those first few calls, and then also how they show up in person for an official visit. The student athlete will start to obviously gather the pros and cons of each school, and again, helping them be clear on that and helping them keep track of that as they go on their various visits and as they journey through the recruiting process. That's another way that we all can like have great impact. I think when it comes to those admissions preview materials, again, just being organized and like, because the summertime is when the student athlete is going to be needing to send that out to the coaches so that the coaches can then send it out to their admissions liaison. All right. So the coaches are kind of working as the in-between between the admissions liaison and the student athlete. So kind of getting all those materials in advance. And just so you know, again, August 1 is when coaches can start meeting face-to-face. So again, that's in that summertime between sophomore and junior year. There are some exceptions to these rules. Again, this is an ever-changing landscape. So right now, lacrosse, both men's and women, basketball, both men's and women, softball, and, I listed basketball first. I should say men's basketball and women's basketball, football and wrestling. Those are a little bit different time frames. And I can speak offline about those kinds of differences and the dates as needed. But just know that some sports are a little bit different. All right. Then this goes into the junior year fall, and this is, again, a really jam-packed semester for them. They're trying to balance taking official visits, which are pretty exhausting in the schedule of a student athlete. Usually they leave on a Thursday and they get back on a Sunday. Depending on how far they have to travel, that can really push those boundaries a lot. And so narrowing it down throughout the spring into summer, and then prior to their official visits, they should really have that pretty narrowed down to really making the choice between like schools that they would really want to go to. And so helping them narrow it down, I think 3 to 4 official visits is kind of like in that sweet spot where if you take more than that, it's just going to be exhausting, and other pieces of their life will be, it'll make maybe their sport not be quite at the highest level because they're missing out on all the training sessions. Their school might falter if they're taking too many visits. So again, helping them get clear on that so that they can be just really intentional about where they're visiting. They're also trying to take SAT and ACT exams starting early in their junior year. It can be really important for the student athlete, again, because we're trying to, on the other end, as coaches and admissions people, we're trying to get as many data points as possible to see if that student athlete can be admitted at the school. So trying to get as clear as we can and get as many data points as we can for that admissions process. That's going to be really helpful. They're also, the student athletes, dealing with various scholarship offers or financial aid reads, and ultimately making that decision. That usually happens in the junior. Fall can be the earliest timeline. It can stretch out to later in the junior year as well. But again, sometime in that junior year is when most sports, that's when most student athletes are going to be making that decision. All right, now let's focus on the most important part, which is where you guys can make an impact. I've started talking on it and touching on it in these various ways. But I think for you guys, I think it's like helping cut out the noise, cut out the pieces of the puzzle that aren't really going to move the needle, and really focusing on what is real, what's important, and what can help a student athlete. I cut out skill level on this slide because that, again, is the coach and the athlete. That's for them to like advance and trying to elevate to the best of their ability. But look at all these amazing green check marks and where we can make an impact from a counselor's standpoint. So let's hit on, oh, actually, I wanted to touch on character. As I mentioned before, this is like a result of them stepping up to the plate in all these other ways. And so, and you guys are amazing builders of character in general. So I didn't want to harp on that kind of stuff because I feel like you guys are the masters of this. And so I'm going to touch on a little bit more of the other pieces of this puzzle that that from my perspective as a past coach can see where you guys can make a great impact. All right, so timely communication. As we mentioned, that sophomore year, helping them get really clear on where they want to maybe go and where they want to like send out their resume to these various coaches at these various institutions. What that looks like, that can really hugely help whether like a coach responds or doesn't respond. Again, is their skill level opening the door or not, and helping them set themselves up for that door to be opened is going to be helpful when it comes to like putting the important pieces in front of the coach for that coach to be able to make that call. This is another quick little blurb up in the top right where the Polaris Athlete Hub can offer some templates to help guide those communication efforts. But in general, what we're looking for is kind of who they are, the grad year, because again, that dictates whether a coach can respond or not respond. So if I have no idea what year in school they are, I'm going to have to send an email back asking them to tell me, and then they have to send an email back. It just creates a lot more repetition of communication that doesn't really need to. It's just like more time. And I would rather it be like a lot more direct. So letting us know, us as coaches know the grad year and the position. So say if I'm trying to get that 150 list down to 7 opportunities, I want to know, or what I've done in the past as a coach is like, I'm like, okay, if I have 7 spots to give out, maybe 3 of them need to be backstrokers because I'm like really short on backstrokers in that school year, in that like team progression school year. So I'm looking for 3 backstrokers, 2 flyers, and an IMer, for instance. So putting their position of how they would fit into what I'm looking for, it can be really helpful. And then obviously why they're interested, why they're reaching out to you, and that's where they can meet that priority and match those priorities of what they're looking for and what they believe the swim team or the various teams to have. And then I cannot harp on this enough. The films and the stats are hugely important. When I would get an email from a student athlete without listing any kind of stats or film or anything, I had no way of knowing whether I should be responding or not as a coach. And so making sure that they have to have those like films or stats, some kind of link so that we can see and properly judge whether that student athlete has a spot on the team or like a potential spot on the team. And then the communication mistakes, I mentioned all these things, but also I'll mention the extra fluff. This is kind of like pretty direct, and I think adding in all these other extra fluff of the various other extracurricular activities, that's not really needed. Again, we're just trying to open the door, right? And so listing out the things that open the door is most important in that initial contact. Everything else of like how they're really impactful in their student government or how they volunteer their time, like that will come into play a lot later on, but that initial contact needs to be pretty direct and pretty fact-oriented. All right. Next one. Okay, so this intentional outreach. And again, this is where the recruiting agencies really miss the mark. When I hear directly from a student athlete, that means that they have taken the time to figure out what is important to them, and they are saying, your school is important to me. And I think that that speaks volumes. Now, how wide that they cast that net, like how many schools are they incorporating in that first initial outreach, is going to really depend on their athletic skill level. If they are really extremely advanced in their sport, maybe that's a lot smaller of a list because they know all those coaches are going to be wanting to recruit them anyway. If their skill level isn't quite at the top, which is a majority of the student athletes, they might need to cast a little bit wider net. For instance, when I was getting recruited before, there's that sophomore year, I sent out a resume to, I think it was about 20 schools that I was like, I would be interested in partaking in, or at least learning more about these 20 different institutions and the coaches and their teams and the cultures and all of those important pieces. But maybe if I was, somebody else that was trying to like kind of stretch themselves into being effective as a team player on that team, maybe I would send it out to 40 and then kind of go from there and see who responds back. So athletic skill level really should direct how wide they cast that net. The other piece is like what types of schools, like this is part of that priority making process of like figuring out where that best lines up. So if they're like really academically strong and they're, pretty good at their sport, but they're not going to be, really making a direct impact immediately, then that might pick, you might choose very carefully of what schools you reach out to. The other thing is when it comes to, this is important to say is that scholarship need or financial aid access should play a part in how they reach out to these schools, and incorporating that fairly early on in the recruiting process can be really helpful for good, clear communication. So say a student athlete is needing a lot of scholarship to be able to attend that institution or any institution. It's important to make note of that early on in the recruiting process. The other thing is financial aid can be really a great tool from a coach's standpoint. If I know that a student athlete did the online financial aid calculator and they're going to qualify for, say, 70% financial aid at my institution, I think that's like huge. That makes me want to recruit that student athlete because maybe I was only willing to give them 20% based on their athletic aid, but if I know they can get 70% and this becomes a much more viable solution for that family, I'm going to recruit them because that means that 20% that I was going to give them, I can put towards another student athlete. So helping families understand like all the pieces of the puzzle and getting that clarity of their priorities and what's important to them early on in the process can help navigate to a really good solution finding, end of the journey. All right. So organization of materials. Obviously, these are all the things that a coach might be asking for, depending on the level of, in the timeline of like when the coach is asking for it. The anticipated course list, that's something that at Stanford we always ask for because again, admissions counselors are trying to like have an admissions pre-read with like limited data points on a student athlete. And so any kind of advanced guesswork of like what that anticipated course list might be for their spring of junior year or potentially for their senior year can help provide some more data points as to is that student athlete challenging themselves. And we hit on all these other pieces, the importance of taking test scores early. And then again, sometimes when it comes to financial aid, just making sure the families are prepared with some of their tax forms because that directly impacts like what kind of financial aid that family might get. They have to submit a lot of these tax forms, and most institutions online will have an online calculator when it comes to financial aid, and filling those out for the schools that student athlete is interested in. Again, that can be provide opportunity or shift their attention elsewhere as needed. So those are the materials. And then I think I think it's important that we talk about playing this long game. Again, not trying to pay attention to the splashy name brand that the student athlete might want to go to based on social media and what everybody else thinks, but like truly getting clear on what is most important to that athlete is good. And then again, skill level opens the door, but all these other pieces help them navigate the whole entire process and be really attractive to the coaches. So everything from like the follow through of the communication, the organization, the taking initiative, this all speaks on the student athlete's maturity and their character, and it really shines a nice light on us for a coach to see that student athlete like excel and elevate themselves when we're looking at, again, a list of 150. So we're trying to find these data points from a coach's point of view, and that's how a student athlete can really look good to a coach. The other thing I'll speak on is resourcefulness. I think it's when we talk about, again, that skill level and making sure that that athlete has advanced and elevated their skill level to the most that they can. I think it's important to hit on like there are different stakeholders in this whole process. Like you guys are definitely a stakeholder. The parents are a stakeholder. The club coaches are a stakeholder. Everybody's kind of like having different lens to help that student athlete find the best fit, and making sure that we are collaborating with all the pieces and all the stakeholders in this to make sure that we're all like trying to get the best, opportunity for these student athletes. And it takes a village. So I think having all these lenses is a really important part of working together to help provide some great opportunities for the student athlete. All right. And that is the fast and furious of recruiting literacy. But I really, this is the pieces that I have found to be helpful in providing some clarity, but I would love to kind of provide any other clarity on any of the topics that you guys are facing out and about in your worlds.
Katie, I just want to say thank you so much for kicking off the conversation here. Before we open up for Q&A, I just really want to emphasize that keeping the main thing, as you pointed out, is so important in regards to the process for these kids. Although it is super exciting and it's their life's work, and for many of them, it's been tied directly to their identity as to who they are since 3, 4, 5 years of age. They're coming up through and they're about to reach and accomplish their dreams, their goals, their aspirations. So it's really easy for them to kind of fall into the hype and the excitement of all of that. But at the same time, by keeping the main thing, and also blocking out some of that noise, it can be not just a transformative moment in terms of that journey for them, but it can also be one where, from a self-discovery standpoint, they can do a lot of reflecting and connecting their interests, strengths, and values and things along those lines. So I think about the schools that you've coached at in terms of, Rutgers, UVA, Tulane, Northwestern, Stanford. I'm sure you've seen countless student athletes come to you who were very well advised. They knew who they were. They knew where they wanted to go with this thing. But in instances where you didn't necessarily see that in a student athlete's journey, what was that like when they matriculated to your program, but without a sense of purpose or without a sense of direction through the process, maybe without a sense of ownership of the process? What was that transition like that they experienced in comparison to their peers who knew who they were and where they were going and why they were going?
Yeah, I think the less educated a student athlete might be on the whole journey, the recruiting journey, the rockier the road that it leads to, and there will be ups and downs, and navigating that can be even more challenging. I will also say that if they don't know the landscape, they make themselves susceptible to coaches who will go in and try and tell them exactly how it is, but it's a bias, obviously, standpoint. And so it makes them more susceptible to getting kind of steamrolled by a coach that wants just to have them on the team and that be it, and not have them look elsewhere. And I think that holistic approach of finding out what's important to them and helping them be fully educated, it gives them that agency. It's not just the college coach saying, this is your timeline, here's what we're doing, here's when you need to make a decision. The student athlete actually has a lot more agency than a coach would naturally admit, to be honest. And so I think making sure that they, again, are super educated on this process so that they know the agency that they have, and it just helps them have a little bit more clean and more just smooth sailing through that recruiting process. And again, cutting out the noise is like hugely important for like reducing stress. And so let's try and reduce that level of anxieties and provide some good, clear pathways forward.
Yeah, no, and now with today's current landscape of college athletics, kids are coming to the table in regards to NIL opportunities that are either already in waiting for them or they're anticipating in terms of being able to earn. So they're carrying extra responsibilities that did not exist 10 years ago. And as a result of that and the world that we live in today, and I think we're feeling it as counselors, especially because the families are feeling it in terms of their youth sports journey. So their road to college, their path to college is starting earlier and earlier, and they're looking at it through a different lens. And they're right in feeling everything that they're feeling, and they're showing up to us as counselors, as stakeholders in the equation, asking us questions that weren't being asked necessarily 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. So I think for you to be able to, take time today and have this discussion with us and just connect those dots in terms of everything, it's a good reminder for us anyways to be able to remember, to prioritize the priorities and to really lean into who that kid is and who they aspire to be and how they can use athletics as that vehicle, and partnering with coaches and programs that align with those values and connecting families with those programs, I think that's where the magic happens for us anyways on this side of the desk. I would love to open this up for questions. I have several other questions, but I can jump in. So if anyone has a question, feel free to fire up. Personally, I think about the youth sports landscape right now in terms of everything. And Isaiah, I'll let you go actually real quick. Thank you. Go for it, Isaiah.
Okay, sorry, I'm trying to turn on my camera, but let me see. Okay, there we go. Maybe that worked. Okay, maybe it's just my voice. There I am. I work with international students, and only one student has come up to me and asked about like this process of recruiting. He started way too late, but and he ended up not going that route at all. But at one point, so I'm in Brazil, and he was talking with coaches at community colleges, and kind of asking. They were, kind of selling like, you can start here, and then we can get you into some other program. Can you talk at all about whether, the possibilities of something like that? How does that look different from this process?
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to go about it when a player is coming into the process on the later side of things. So I think community college is a great kind of like starting point to then jump off into maybe other, division schools that are more 4-year programs. I will say that from what I know, and I'm a little bit less experienced on the, junior colleges and all of that, but I think from my experience, those are great spots, and the coaches can be really good at developing, and they don't like hold on to a student athlete. Like they're helpful in providing opportunity beyond that. So yeah, I think that's a great opportunity to start with those JUCOs and then later kind of help them transition to being into a 4-year institution if that's kind of their goal.
Is there a way that I could like cut through and see like, okay, what is this actually like the strong program that they mentioned? Like, I mean, some obvious things stand out. Like, are they winning?
Right. Yeah, I would ask those questions, and I think that helping them ask the right questions. So maybe ask, who from their program has gone on, where have those athletes gone on to, and those are the kind of questions that they can ask the coach when those communication lines are open. But yeah, I think that kind of helps paint the picture, right? And then you can also, like, I think a great question for a student athlete to ask a coach is like, where do you see me fitting in on this team, right? Are you going to play me right away? Or am I going to sit the bench for a year? You know, like, how are you going to help me develop? I think those are good, clear questions that a student athlete can absolutely. And as a coach, I've been asked those very directly. And I love those questions because it speaks to like where that student athlete is hoping to make an impact.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Brandy, it looks like you have a hand up. I'm seeing. Oh, hang on a second. I think, how do we unmute you? Uh-oh. Jeff, can you help me? There we go.
Let me see. I'm going to try here. Brandy, are you able to unmute? Because I don't have. Brandy, are you able to turn your microphone on? Or if you want to drop it in the, if you want to drop your question in the chat, you can do that as well. I'm not seeing it, Brandy. Let's see here.
Are you guys able to hear?
Yes, we can hear you now. Awesome. Go for it.
You?
There you go. You're good. Brandy, you're live. Go for it.
All right, hold up. Okay.
Awesome. We can hear you.
Should be good. Yes. All right. Sorry, I have like
No
four
worries.
different microphones. I'm also
Yeah.
an esports coach, so I have a lot of tech here in front of me. I always defaults to the wrong mic for some reason, so sorry about that.
No worries. It's one of those. It's Friday, May 1st, so we're all feeling
yeah,
it.
for real. So I'm a school counselor in Pennsylvania. So, you know, I work with a decent amount of student athletes. I'm at a Catholic school. So I definitely appreciate what you were saying about, you know, trying to like reduce anxiety and, you know, taking into account students like mental health and their overall well-being in this process. So then I was surprised when you recommended taking like the SAT or ACT really early in junior year. Especially with over 80% of colleges and universities being test optional. I find that those like standardized tests lend an extra piece of anxiety that a lot of my students don't necessarily need. And so while I understand like your, you know, goal is to have like a lot of data points, sometimes I feel like that standardized test data point isn't really helpful as it's not really indicative of a student's like capability. So I just wanted to kind of like get your thoughts on that piece of things.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. Those standardized tests are like, can be really awful. And I know that a lot of universities have taken away that's a need for admissions. There are still institutions that do require that. Stanford at one point had taken it away and then they brought it back. So again, that's probably
most of the Ivy Leagues brought it back, but that was more just a way to cut down their application numbers so they didn't have to hire more admissions people.
And I think it's also important to note that from a packaging standpoint, in terms of being able to offer aid money, that for a lot of student athletes, they are able to close that gap just with that if they're able to demonstrate via test score in instances. So, you know, there's student athletes that are mentors for us over on within our mentor program that as a result of being able to demonstrate via an ACT or an SAT score, they were able to receive merit-based money to help close that gap for them. So in instances like that, it's a valuable asset in the process in terms of being able to to help in that sense. But
It's a hard
I know-
sell for me when you look at the
It
actual
is.
data as to what the SATs, like
Right.
the strongest correlation is actually with like parents' income. So the higher
Right.
the score,
No,
the
and
higher parent
we're
income. So
both-
that's still a tough sell for me.
Brandy, and I would say, if for those that know me would know that I'm one of the biggest advocates for test optional, test free admissions. And but it is still important for us to share the realities and just put that out from a timeline perspective for families to be aware of in regards to closing that gap. So, but you and I, we're all in complete agreement.
Sure. And I would typically only recommend my juniors, like if they showed like, pretty well on the PSAT, which all of my students take the PSAT. So I have like a baseline for that, but I don't recommend that they really start taking SAT until spring of their junior year, just because I feel like at that point is when they have more of those, like more of the math foundation that they really need to do their best.
Yeah, and Brandy, this is where that priority piece is important too. So like if they are not going to be applying for like the Ivy Leagues and the Stanfords of the world, like, yeah, let's put that off later on. That would be, I think that's totally fine. I think learning what those priorities are and then learning like where they want to be directing their impact, like, where they want to be directing their communication. So I'm totally in agreement. Like Jeff and I have talked about this for a long time about like access and like it should not be socioeconomic status related and all of that. So I'm full on board with that. I think Jeff mentioned that merit scholarship, and that there are still merit scholarships out there that are directly related to the SAT and ACT. And even at my time at Tulane, like you can combine academic and athletic scholarship. So if I know a student athlete, they got a 32 on the ACT, that would immediately qualify for 50% academic scholarship, then I would need to only provide maybe 40% athletic scholarship. And together that's a 90% package deal that helps provide opportunity for that student athlete. So that is why I mention it, because that merit scholarship can be important. But again, it depends on what the priorities are of that student athlete. So if scholarship or, any kind of like merit-based aid isn't what they're going for, or isn't important to them or their family, then pushing that to a little bit later on, once they have a little bit more maturity from an academic standpoint, that would be totally fine.
Yeah, and not to go down the testing rabbit hole here, because again, huge advocate for test free and test optional admissions. We're in agreement there, but we do partner with Revolution Prep to offer every kid 2 free hours of test prep and then access to all their free practice exams, both ACT, SAT, that they host every Saturday, just because if that is something for kids to explore and to use as a tool to help close that gap, they should have access to that. So it's something that I do want to be mindful of as part of the process, but not, it's not a linear must within the process. But every family should be aware that is available for them should they need to use those tools for their advantage. Saigus, do you have a question?
Let me put my mic on.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Hearable?
Yes, sir.
Awesome. I get this question often from students and parents. Is there any coach of any club sports team of any college in the United States that has any influence on a student's admission to college?
Yes. I think it depends, different divisions have different polls from an admission standpoint. In the Division I stratosphere, there can be a good amount of pull. In fact, there can be a huge amount of pull depending on the academic institution. So yes is the short answer. I think it comes from, we as coaches, like even at the University of Virginia, my job was to like submit like a document of like why that athlete is going to be impactful on our team and why they're going to be successful as a student at the University of Virginia. So we would write these like essays behind supporting a student athlete when we were trying to help get them into school. So yeah, we did have some pull. Some institutions don't. Like Ivy Leagues have very limited pull, and other schools, again, it can be a wide range of how much leverage they have with the admissions process. But yes is the answer, and yeah. And again, helping that athlete ask the right questions to the coach regarding like that process can be really impactful. Because again, how I would answer that at Stanford versus how I answered that at Tulane versus how I answered that at Rutgers, it was all very different. So like going through that process and helping them ask the right questions for that coaches can be hugely, influential.
Yeah, that's been my experience where, for example, the person who's the club field hockey coach at Penn State has much more influence because they, in the National Field Hockey League, they're typically one of the top teams. Many of my parents are thinking, well, my kid probably isn't going to be able to make it at the varsity level. So let's see if we can get some pull with the club level. So I thank you for your comments, Katie.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Christy, and then Ian.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes. Yep.
Sorry about that. At our school, we have a pretty hefty postgraduate group, and we have a lot of parents that ask a lot of questions about reclassing, which has been pretty standard, and we can navigate that. But the NCAA is proposing those new age rules where we have to be a little more cognizant of whether or not they're graduating, and if they're going to be 19 before becoming freshmen. So I'm just wondering if there's any advice for our parents when they're asking questions about should we reclass, when it's been typically there's absolutely no rush, and now it's kind of there's a clock on that you graduate.
Yeah, and that really is dictated by the NCAA and the legislation. So like when that clock starts for a student athlete, a lot of that has to do with like when they're graduating high school, right? And so that gap year can be great. That gap year can be great from when they start their clock, but also like as far as that recruiting timeline, that still needs to happen on the earlier slide, even if they're like taking that gap year off. So that's a tricky one to answer clearly, I think. But when it comes to, I'm a full proponent of like taking a gap year when it's needed. I think that can be really great for the student athlete, for their maturity from a athletic standpoint, but also just like an overall standpoint of like prepping to be in a, in a college setting. So as far as like what that looks like, I'd have to dive into the NCAA manual and make sure that I would be answering that correctly. I can put a note and answer you offline to answer that question more clearly and to make sure I'm up to date on all the like timelines and all of that.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. A lot of our recruiting does happen in that grade 13, so that might also just be specific to us.
Okay. No, that's good to know. Thanks.
Thank you.
Ian.
That kind of touched on a little bit of my question, but maybe the more refined point, Katie, is how things might change given some of those new rules in the recruitment game, right? Like any insight into like how some of the most recent things happening in, I don't know, or even the transfer portal kind of, I don't know. I feel like students should be sticking a little longer than they should, but like, will some of the new rules hopefully help that?
Do I have a crystal ball? Not exactly, but I appreciate your question because I think that reminds me of some things that I can say is that because of the transfer portal being a lot more fluid these days, I think those opportunities kind of like those one-off opportunities like, oh, we might actually have a roster spot now. And I just found out about this time for this coming fall. And so it does create some later opportunities for student athletes to like get a quick in. It doesn't, I will say they're like limited and they're a little bit harder to find, but they are out there. So if that helps like reduce the stress of like, you can go through this process a little bit later and there will be opportunity. It's not going to be everywhere and it's not going to be widespread, but you can find it if you are willing to look hard enough and probably wide enough. And like, that's where like as counselors, like helping the student athlete, like really go beyond the splashy name brand schools and like think outside of that scope to provide opportunities that like fit their timeline, their needs, and their priorities.
Yeah, to piggyback off of that, Katie, I would say there's never been a time in college athletics where college counseling is more needed on the front end of this thing in terms of working with student athletes, not just from a a standpoint of moving them onward to their higher ed landing spot from an athletic standpoint, but in them finding their fit, knowing why they're going, where they're going, and being able to see past that athletic opportunity that's there at that institution and connect with, from an inward standpoint, being able to make that connection as to why they're there. That's the role of us as counselors, and that's the work that we've always done. With the volatility of the transfer portal, as we continue to do that work with these student athletes, regardless of what is happening in those meeting rooms and on those rosters, they're going to understand why they are going where they're going. And, I feel as though that's the alignment that we need now more than ever in college athletics. So it was really great having you on board today, and really enjoyed your presentation here. Katie's email is down below here. Please feel free, shoot her an email, any questions that you have and everything of that nature. Katie, I really appreciate you taking the time to touch base today. Next month, actually, June 5th will be part 3 of our 3-part series. And we're going to come full circle with things in regards to the human performance, somatic mapping, mindfulness, and everything along those lines as it relates to the student athlete experience, building student athletes and providing them with the tools for their toolbox to navigate that transition successfully. Katie, thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, everybody, for your time today. Thanks for the questions at the end. Again, I'm happy to answer questions offline, so please send me an email. I'd be more than happy to be a resource for you guys.